On a busy Saturday afternoon, the large department store in the center of town was filled with the usual rhythm of footsteps, shopping carts, and quiet background music. Bright lights reflected off polished floors, and the air carried the mixed scent of fresh fabric, plastic packaging, and coffee from the cafe near the entrance. Customers moved between aisles with purpose. Families compared prices. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves, asking for toys. Employees stood near registers, scanning items and smiling politely as they repeated the same greetings dozens of times throughout the day. From a distance, the store seemed peaceful, ordinary, almost predictable, but inside the mind of one store employee, something felt wrong. Daniel Carter had worked in the store for nearly 6 years. At 38 years old, he was known among his coworkers as someone who took his job seriously, sometimes a little too seriously. He believed that order mattered, that rules existed for a reason, and that the store's reputation depended on employees like him staying alert over the years. Daniel had seen many shoplifters. Some were teenagers trying to sneak cosmetics into their backpacks. Others were adults who casually slipped expensive electronics into their coats. There had even been organized theft rings who came in groups, distracting staff while others quietly filled bags with merchandise. Each time it happened, Daniel felt personally responsible to him. Theft was not just about money. It was about honesty, respect, and the idea that people should earn what they take. So when he noticed the teenager near the electronics aisle, his instincts immediately awakened. The boy looked no older than 16. He wore faded sneakers, slightly worn jeans, and a gray hoodie that seemed a little too big for him. His hair was messy, and his backpack hung loosely from one shoulder at first glance. There was nothing unusual about him. Teenagers came to the store all the time, but something about the way the boy moved caught Daniel's attention. The teenager walked slowly through the aisles, stopping often, looking carefully at items, sometimes picking something up and examining it for several seconds before putting it back. Then he would glance around the store, not in the casual way of a shopper looking for the next aisle, but in a cautious, almost nervous way. Daniel noticed the pattern immediately. The boy would pick up something small, look around, put it back, then continue walking. Daniel had seen that behavior many times before. To him, it was the body language of someone deciding what to steal. Without saying anything, Daniel stepped away from the register area and slowly moved toward the electronics section. He pretended to organize a shelf of headphones while keeping the boy within his peripheral vision. The teenager stopped in front of a display of phone chargers. He picked one up, examined it, looked around, then placed it back. Daniel's suspicion deepened in his mind. The situation was already forming into a familiar story. A teenager wandering the store alone. Nervous glances. A backpack that could easily hide small items. It matched the pattern he had seen many times before. Daniel decided to watch more closely. The boy continued moving through the aisles. He walked past gaming accessories, portable speakers, and small electronics. Each time he stopped, he would study the item carefully, then slowly return it to the shelf. But what Daniel noticed most was the hesitation. The boy seemed unsure of himself, almost like he was debating something in his mind. From Daniel's perspective, that hesitation meant one thing. The teenager was waiting for the right moment. Daniel moved quietly from one aisle to the next, pretending to straighten products while keeping a careful eye on the boy. Other customers passed by without noticing anything unusual, but Daniel's attention was now fully locked on the teenager. In his mind, he was protecting the store. He told himself he was preventing a crime before it happened. Minutes passed. The boy eventually left the electronics section and walked toward the stationery aisle. There he stopped again, looking at notebooks, pens, and small office supplies. Daniel followed from a distance. The teenager picked up a small, notebook and flipped through its pages slowly. For a moment, his expression softened. Then he placed it back on the shelf again. He looked around. Daniel's suspicion grew stronger to him. The pattern was becoming clearer. The boy wasn't shopping. He was searching, looking for something easy to take. Daniel felt quiet frustration building inside him. He had seen this before. Young people who believed stealing small things did not matter. Teenagers who thought stores would never notice a missing item. But Daniel believed in accountability, and if the boy tried anything, Daniel was determined to stop him. The teenager continued walking. Now he moved toward the grocery section near the back of the store. He paused at a display of bottled drinks and snacks. Daniel followed, pretending to check expiration dates on nearby shelves. The boy picked up a bottle of water. He stared at it for a long moment, then slowly placed it back. His shoulders dropped slightly, as if disappointment had quietly settled over him. Daniel noticed something in that moment that made him pause. The boy looked tired, not the tiredness of someone who had stayed up too late playing video games, but a deeper exhaustion, the kind that showed in someone's posture, in the slow movement of their hands, in the quiet heaviness behind their eyes. For a brief second, Daniel wondered if he might be misreading the situation, but the thought disappeared. Quickly, experience had taught him that hesitation was often part of theft. People who planned to steal often looked nervous. They hesitated, they waited, they searched for the right opportunity. The boy walked again. Now he moved toward the clothing section. Daniel followed. At this point, he had been watching the teenager for nearly 15 minutes, and in Daniel's mind, there was only one explanation. The boy was waiting for the perfect moment to steal something. Daniel decided it was time to act, not publicly, not dramatically, but carefully. He stepped closer to the aisle where the teenager stood, pretending to fold a stack of shirts. The boy picked up a pair of gloves from a display rack. For a long moment, he held them in his hands. Then he looked at the price tag. His fingers tightened slightly around the fabric. Daniel watched closely. His heart beat a little faster. In that moment, Daniel believed he was about to catch the boy in the act. But instead, something unexpected happened. The teenager slowly returned the gloves to the rack. Then he lowered his head, and quietly began walking toward the exit. Daniel's suspicion instantly transformed into certainty to him. The behavior made perfect sense. The boy had realized someone was watching. So, no, he was leaving before trying anything. But Daniel wasn't going to let the situation end like that. He stepped forward, his voice calm but firm, ready to stop the teenager before he could disappear into the crowd. And in that moment, Daniel had no idea that the truth behind the boy's visit to the store would soon leave the entire room silent with embarrassment. The automatic glass doors near the store entrance slid open and closed in a steady rhythm as customers entered and exited throughout the afternoon. Outside, the sunlight reflected off the parking lot, and the distant noise of traffic hummed like a constant backdrop to the quiet routine inside the store, just a few steps away from those doors. The teenager continued walking with slow, uncertain steps. Behind him, Daniel Carter followed. At this point, Daniel's suspicion had hardened into certainty. Years of experience had taught him that people who intended to steal often left the store quickly when they realized they were being watched. It was a pattern he believed he understood well, and now he believed the boy was doing exactly that. The teenager's shoulders were slightly hunched, and his hands stayed close to the straps of his backpack as he moved toward the exit. His pace was not fast, but it carried the quiet urgency of someone who wanted to disappear unnoticed. Daniel stepped forward. He spoke calmly, but firmly enough to stop the boy before he reached the doors. The teenager froze. For a moment, the entire scene slowed. Nearby customers paused their shopping, sensing tension in the air. A mother pushing a cart stopped briefly to glance in their direction. Two young employees behind the customer service desk looked up from their computers. The boy slowly turned around. From up close, he looked even younger than Daniel had first thought. His face was thin, his eyes tired, and there was something fragile about the way he held himself, as though he carried a quiet burden that no one else could see. Daniel looked directly at him. Inside Daniel's mind, the situation was already clear. He believed he had caught someone trying to steal. Without raising his voice, Ateneo asked the boy to step aside so they could talk. The teenager's eyes flickered with confusion, but he did not argue. He simply nodded and followed Daniel toward a quieter corner near the customer service desk. Several employees had already begun watching. Moments like this always attracted attention. The possibility of catching a shoplifter often stirred curiosity among staff members who rarely saw such situations unfold directly. Daniel asked the boy if he had taken anything from the store. The question hung heavily in the air. The teenager shook his head. His expression was not angry, not defensive. It was simply tired. Daniel felt a brief flicker of uncertainty. Again, but he pushed the thought aside. He had seen many shoplifters deny accusations before. It was part of the pattern. Daniel calmly explained that he had been watching the boy for several minutes. He described the way the teenager had moved through different aisles, picking up items and looking around nervously to Daniel. The behavior clearly suggested someone preparing to steal. More employees had now gathered nearby. Their quiet curiosity filled the space like an invisible audience. The boy stood. Silently, he listened, but he did not interrupt. When Daniel asked to check the backpack, the teenager hesitated for a brief moment, not in anger, not in defiance, but in a quiet, uncertain way. Then slowly, he removed the backpack from his shoulder and placed it on the counter. The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel opened the bag. Inside, there were only a few items: a worn notebook, several folded papers, a small pencil case, and a thin envelope. No stolen merchandise, no electronics, no store items, just ordinary belongings. Daniel felt a brief wave of discomfort move through his chest, but suspicion still lingered in his mind. He examined the contents carefully. The notebook contained handwritten notes. The pages were filled with neat writing, diagrams, and what appeared to be school assignments. The pencil case held only 2 pencils and an eraser worn down from heavy use. Then Daniel opened the envelope. Inside were several documents. One of them immediately caught his attention. It was a printed letter from a school. Daniel read the first few lines. The letter explained that the student had been selected for a regional academic competition. The competition required participants to bring certain materials, including specific notebooks, writing tools, and study guides. Daniel's eyes moved further down the page. Another paper was a list of supplies, many of the same items the boy had been looking at throughout the store: notebooks, pens, a charger for an old model tablet, a few inexpensive school supplies. Each item had a price written next to it in small handwriting. And besides several of those prices were tiny calculations, the kind someone might make while trying to determine what they could afford. Daniel felt a quiet shift inside his chest. He looked at the teenager again. The boy stood still, his hands resting quietly at his sides. There was no anger in his face, no attempt to defend himself, only a quiet patience. Daniel looked back at the list at the bottom of the page. One final note had been written, a small sentence, barely noticeable. At first glance, it simply read, "Only buy what you can afford." Next to it was a number, a very small number. It was clear now. The boy had been comparing prices, calculating what he could afford with the little money he had. Every time he picked up an item and put it back, it wasn't hesitation about stealing it. Was disappointment, the realization that the price was too high. Daniel suddenly remembered the moment in the grocery aisle, when the boy had picked up the bottle of water and stared at it. Now that moment made sense. The boy wasn't deciding whether to steal it, he was deciding whether he could afford it. A quiet silence spread through the area. Some employees had begun to notice the documents on the counter. Curiosity slowly transformed into discomfort. The story they had imagined only minutes earlier was beginning to collapse. Daniel closed the envelope. Slowly, for the first time since the situation began, he truly looked at the teenager not as a suspect, but as a person. And what he saw made something inside him sink. The boy's shoes were worn. His backpack was old. His hoodie had been washed so many times that the color had faded. Everything about him suggested someone doing their best with very little, but the most striking thing was the quiet dignity in the way he stood there. He had not raised his voice. He had not protested. He had simply allowed the accusation to unfold. And now, the truth sat plainly on the counter for everyone to see. The employees who had gathered nearby began exchanging uncomfortable glances. No one spoke, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel felt a deep heat rising in his face. The confidence he had felt earlier now felt heavy and misplaced. The teenager slowly reached for the envelope. He placed the papers back inside with careful movements, as if protecting something important. Then he lifted his backpack again. The room remained silent, and in that silence, something far more powerful than any argument was beginning to grow. Embarrassment, not for the boy, but for everyone who had silently assumed the worst, and Daniel could feel that realization beginning to settle over the entire store like a heavy cloud. But what none of them realized yet was that the boy's story and the truth behind why he needed those supplies was about to make the situation even more difficult to face. The silence around the customer service desk grew heavier with each passing second. What had started as a routine suspicion had slowly turned into an uncomfortable realization for everyone watching. The quiet crowd of employees who had gathered moments earlier no longer looked curious. Their expressions had changed. Some stared down at the floor. Others pretended to organize nearby shelves. Avoiding eye contact, the confidence that had filled the room earlier had vanished. In its place was an awkward stillness. The teenager carefully placed the envelope back inside his worn backpack and zipped it shut. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he had already accepted the situation and simply wanted to leave. There was no anger in his actions, no dramatic reaction, just quiet resignation. Daniel Carter stood still, his mind racing with thoughts he hadn't expected to have. The certainty he had felt earlier now seemed painfully misplaced. Every moment he had spent watching the boy through the aisles replayed in his memory. But now those same moments looked completely different. The boy picking up the notebook, the way he studied the prices, the small calculations written beside each item, the disappointed expression when he returned things to the shelves. Daniel had interpreted all of it as suspicious behavior. But now the truth was painfully obvious. The boy had simply been trying to figure out what he could afford. Daniel felt a heavy knot forming in his chest. Years of experience had made him confident in his instincts. But this moment forced him to confront something he had never fully questioned before. Assumptions without realizing it. He had already decided who the boy was the moment he noticed his worn clothes and nervous movements, and that decision had shaped everything that followed. The teenager lifted the backpack onto his shoulder and took a small step toward the exit. The movement seemed to wake the room from its silence. One of the younger, KISS employees glanced at Daniel, unsure of what should happen next. Daniel looked down at the counter again. The list of school supplies still lay there. The small handwriting, the careful price calculations, the final note at the bottom of the page. Only buy what you can afford, Daniel. Slowly picked up the paper again. This time he noticed something he had missed earlier. Besides, several of the prices were small. CHECKMARKS. Next to other items were faint lines crossing them out. The pattern revealed a quiet struggle. The boy had been making decisions, choosing which things he could possibly buy, and which things he would have to leave behind. Daniel also noticed the name, written at the top of the page, Ethan Alvarez. The name stirred a vague sense of recognition. Daniel couldn't immediately place it, but something about it felt familiar. Ethan had almost reached the doors now. He moved with quiet determination, clearly hoping to leave before the situation drew any more attention. But Daniel suddenly realized something important. If Ethan left now, the entire situation would remain unfinished. The boy would walk away with the memory of being publicly suspected of theft, and the employees standing nearby would carry their silent embarrassment without confronting it. Daniel stepped forward. His voice was quieter now. Carrying none of the earlier authority, he asked the boy to wait for a moment. Ethan stopped again. He turned slowly, his expression calm but guarded. Daniel walked closer, holding the list of supplies. For the first time since the situation began, Daniel allowed himself to truly see the boy, not as a suspect, but as a young person carrying responsibilities far beyond his years. Up close, the signs were impossible to ignore. The exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet tension in the way he stood, the careful way he held his backpack, as if everything inside it mattered. Daniel asked about the academic competition mentioned in the letter. The moment the question was asked, something subtle changed in Ethan's posture. His shoulders straightened slightly. For the first time, a hint of pride flickered across his face, even without spoken words. It was clear that the competition meant something important to him. Daniel looked again at the documents. The letter described a regional academic program designed for students with exceptional performance in science and mathematics. Only a small number of students from each district had been selected. Daniel read the school name printed on the letter. Suddenly, the recognition clicked. The school had recently appeared in the local news. One of its students had achieved the highest score in the district science exams. Daniel's eyes moved back to the name at the top of the paper, Ethan Alvarez. A quiet wave of realization passed through him. The boy standing in front of him wasn't just a student trying to buy school supplies. He was the top student in the entire district. The same student the local newspaper had praised just weeks earlier for his academic achievements. Despite difficult circumstances, Daniel felt the weight of that realization settled deeply. The boy had been recognized for his hard work, intelligence, and determination. And yet, inside the store today, he had been treated as a potential thief. Daniel noticed that several other employees were beginning to understand the situation as well. One of them had quietly picked up the school letter and was reading it carefully. The expressions around the room shifted again, but this time the feeling wasn't just embarrassment, it was something heavier. Respect, the story hidden inside. Those papers revealed something far more powerful than anyone had expected. Ethan wasn't wandering the store aimlessly. He had been trying to prepare for an opportunity that could change his future, but his limited money meant every decision mattered, every dollar, every item, every choice. And in the middle of that quiet struggle, he had been followed, watched, and publicly suspected of theft. Daniel suddenly understood why the boy had not argued earlier why he had simply stood there while his backpack was searched. Ethan was used to being misunderstood, used to being judged. Before anyone knew his story, Daniel felt something shift inside him. A deep awareness of how quickly assumptions could distort reality. The teenager who had looked suspicious from a distance was actually someone fighting quietly for a better future. And the entire store had almost missed that truth completely. Ethan adjusted the strap of his backpack again and looked toward the exit. He had endured the accusation with patience. Now he simply wanted to leave. But Daniel knew that if Ethan walked out now, the lesson unfolding inside the store would remain incomplete. Because sometimes the most powerful moments of justice were not about punishment. They were about recognition, and the truth about Ethan Alvarez was something the entire room needed to understand. But none of them yet realized that the next few minutes would transform this uncomfortable mistake into something no one inside the store would ever forget. The automatic doors continued to open and close as customers came and went, unaware that something meaningful was unfolding just a few steps away inside the store. Ethan Alvarez stood near the entrance, his backpack resting quietly on one shoulder. The weight of the moment seemed to settle around him, yet he remained calm, almost as if he had already accepted the misunderstanding and simply wanted to move forward. Behind him, a small group of employees remained gathered near the customer service desk, but the energy in the room had completely changed. What had started as curiosity had turned into reflection. Daniel Carter stood still for a moment, holding the list of supplies in his hand. The paper suddenly felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than just ink and numbers. It carried a reminder of how quickly assumptions could lead people to the wrong conclusions. Daniel took a slow breath. For years, he had believed that experience made him a better judge of situations. He trusted his instincts and believed that paying attention to suspicious behavior protected the store. But this moment forced him to confront something deeper. The experience could guide a person, but assumptions could blind them. Daniel walked slowly toward Ethan. The boy turned slightly, watching him approach. His expression remained quiet and reserved, but there was something thoughtful in his eyes, as if he had already processed the entire situation in his mind. Daniel looked down again at the list of supplies each item represented. Something small but meaningful. A notebook for writing ideas, pens for practice, exams, a charger for an old tablet used for studying. None of the items were expensive, but together, they represented something much bigger. Opportunity. Daniel realized that Ethan had spent nearly 20 minutes in the store, carefully studying each item, trying to decide which supplies he could afford and which ones he would have to leave behind. That quiet struggle had been completely invisible to everyone else. Instead, the employees had seen something entirely different. They had seen suspicion. They had seen doubt. They had seen a potential thief. Daniel felt the weight of that realization deeply. But this moment also offered something else, a chance to respond differently. Daniel turned slightly and looked at the other employees who had gathered nearby. Several of them were still reading the documents from Ethan's envelope, the letter from the school, the competition invitation, the list of supplies. The expressions on their faces showed a mixture of admiration and regret. Some of them had recognized Ethan's name now as well, the student who had achieved the highest science score in the district, the student whose story had appeared briefly in the local newspaper, a young person who had earned an opportunity that could change his future. And yet, inside the store today, he had been quietly judged before anyone knew the truth. Daniel gently placed the list of supplies back on the counter. Then he did something no one expected. He walked toward the stationery aisle, where Ethan had spent so much time earlier. Several employees followed him with their eyes. Unsure of what he was doing, Daniel stopped at the display of notebooks. He picked up one that matched the item, listed on Ethan's paper. Then he moved to another shelf and selected the pens the boy had. Written down next, he walked to the electronics. Eileen picked up the charger that Ethan had carefully examined. Earlier, each item was small, simple, ordinary. But together, they represented the pieces of a future Ethan had been trying to build. Daniel carried the items back toward the front of the store. Ethan watched quietly. He seemed surprised, but he remained silent. The employees gathered nearby began to understand what Daniel was doing, and something unexpected happened. One of the younger workers stepped away and returned with another item from the list. Another employee quietly added a set of study notebooks. Someone else brought a small pack of HIGHLIGHTERS. Within a few minutes, nearly every item on Ethan's list had been gathered on the counter. The collection of supplies grew into a small pile. Each item placed there represented more than just an object. It represented a shift in understanding, a quiet effort to correct a mistake. Daniel looked at Skua. Ethan, the boy's expression had changed slightly. For the first time since the situation began, the heaviness in his posture seemed to soften. There was still a quiet reserve in his eyes, but something warmer had appeared alongside it. Something closer to relief. Daniel carefully placed the final item on the counter. Then he stepped back. No one in the store raised their voice. There was no lead dramatic announcement, just a quiet moment where everyone understood what had happened. The supplies were purchased and placed inside a new backpack provided by the store. Ethan accepted it with a mixture of gratitude and quiet disbelief. But the most powerful part of the moment was not the items themselves. It was the recognition, for the first time since entering the store. Ethan was being seen not as someone suspicious, but as someone admirable, a student working hard to create a better future, a young person carrying determination far beyond his years. As Ethan prepared to leave, the employees watched him walk toward the doors again, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. The same doors that had nearly become the exit of a painful misunderstanding were now the beginning of something better. Ethan stepped outside into the sunlight. The afternoon air felt lighter behind him. Inside the store, Daniel remained standing near the entrance. He watched the boy walk across the parking lot until he disappeared from view. Daniel knew he would never forget this day, not because of embarrassment, but because of the lesson hidden inside it. A lesson about how easily people can misunderstand someone they barely know. A lesson about how quickly appearances can mislead. And most importantly, a lesson about the quiet strength carried by people whose struggles are invisible to the world around them. Sometimes the most important stories are not the ones people assume. They are the ones waiting patiently beneath the surface, hoping someone will take the time to truly see them. And from that day forward, everyone who had witnessed the moment inside the store carried that reminder with them, because sometimes the greatest act of justice is simply choosing to understand before deciding who someone really is.